Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. Our third series has been focusing on the issue of citizenship. My guest today on the show, Eric Liu, has, I think, made a career in many ways out of trying to make citizenship sexy. He is the CEO of Citizen University and the author of a number of best-selling books about citizenship and identity, and as well as the co-author of Our Common Purpose, I guess it's a white paper authored with him and some other notables in 2020 about strengthening citizenship in America. So Eric, let me start you out with a simple question. How do we make citizenship sexier?
Well, Andrew, first of all, thank you for having me. I think the premise of the question is that to most people, civic life, citizenship is a sleep-inducing, boring topic. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to engage in it, and they certainly don't want to learn about it. And yet, I think the reality that we've learned over and over again over these last several years, certainly during the pandemic, is, if I may roughly paraphrase Lenin, not John Lennon, but Vladimir. You may not care about civics, but civics cares about you. That the forces and trends and shifts in power that are unfolding in civic, social, and economic life around us are going to shape the course of your life and widen or narrow your prospects and possibilities, and it behooves all of us to actually think about how we can shape it. And so, at core to my work and the work of my organization, Citizen University, is this idea that one way to make civics more sexy and to make it more compelling to people is to make it unabashedly about what it really is about, and that is power. The problem is that for so many people, especially where civics is taught in schools or how it's even discussed in the paper, it's very procedural. Are there enough votes to break the filibuster? How does ranked choice voting work? What are the qualifications to get on the ballot and so forth? And all of those are crucially important, but beneath all of those procedural questions is a dynamic of power. And I think if we can be honest and candid and clear-eyed about the nature of power and how, I define power as a capacity to ensure that others do as we would like them to do. When you apply that capacity to questions of common interest in civic life, everybody's interested in that. Everybody, especially young people, are always thinking about how relatively powerless they feel, how much they wish they had more voice and agency. And to make this topic more about how can you become literate in power and be able to read and write power makes it a far more compelling topic than how a bill becomes a law.
It's interesting, Eric, that you bring up Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He wasn't a particularly sophisticated political theorist, and I think his legacy, if anything, is as a theorist of power. Lenin reminded us, for better or worse, that power is in the fist. What's so sexy about that?
Well, Lenin's conception of power was that it was in the fist or at the barrel of a gun, to quote Mao later. I think.
But wasn't he right, Eric? I mean, isn't that what power is?
He was partially right. Part of what we teach in our work at Citizen University is that to understand power in the first place is to get over the first reflex of revulsion that many people have, that power is a dirty word, it's a dirty topic, it's about dark arts or about mere domination. And I don't want to have any part in that. And all of our usages of the word power have a negative valence: power trip, power hungry, power mad. And so number one, get over those qualms, because the reality of the study of power is that those who have and hold and hoard power are perfectly content for you to be to self-censor yourself and to make yourself illiterate willingly in the topic. They're perfectly happy to take your quantum of power, as you put your head in the sand. But the second thing I would say is that if you take your head out of the sand and look more broadly at the meaning of power in civic and economic and social life, you recognize that there are various sources of power. Force, violence is one of them, absolutely. And when you think about Leninist states or Maoist states, force is often married with another source of power, and that is state action, government power. But there are many other sources of power that certainly we in the United States, you in San Francisco, me in Seattle right now, are acutely, painfully aware of. Money is a source of power. The unequal distribution and circulation of wealth and concentration of wealth yields great imbalances in power. But ideas are as well a source of power. And the power of an idea is borne out in the existence of the United States as the United States. It's borne out in the existence of communism as communism. Ideas can carry people in ways that mere force and mere intimidation cannot. All of these different sources of power we have intuitions about them, but I think what it requires to live like a citizen is to go from mere basic intuition to intention and to the intentional practice of power. And that is a body of work best done not alone. It's best done in the company of others because in civic life, all power is collective.
Wouldn't it be fair to say also that, at least when it comes to America, virtue, or the idea of virtue, is power. Religion is power, a sense of morality and perhaps of moral superiority.
Moral power, moral suasion combines both the power of ideas and the power of social norms. And it absolutely is part of the mix here. And I think our understanding of what power is in civic life is often reduced to mass popular culture notions of, oh, power, oh, that's what they do in Game of Thrones. Power, that's how things go down in House of Cards.
Is that also the treatment of American politics on the networks, on Fox and CNN?
Absolutely. It is. It is.
Power, politics as power, or politics essentially as sport?
Politics as sport, but politics as a spectator sport. And that is the danger of how so much of these popular mass depictions of civic life and power and politics, how they unfold. They make us sit back and watch and be entertained, right? And we fall into the habit of audience, critic, spectator, rather than co-author, co-creator, participant.
So ironically, Eric, the mass spectacle of power in America is in the business of disempowering citizens.
It is. I mean, that's one could say that the mass power of entertainment capitalism is, in a sense, about disempowering us. It has
consciously or not. Are you a kind of a Gramscian, a cultural Marxist in this sense?
I'm not a cultural Marxist, but I am. But I think it's here's my approach on the relationship of culture and power. A lot of our work at Citizen University is also grounded in this idea that we live in a time right now, Andrew, as you well know, where so many of the discussions about power and politics are about structural change, right? We've got to structurally change our criminal justice system. We've got to make structural change to address racial inequity, structural change to make this upside down tax system that we have right side up, structural change in how we think about immigration and who belongs. And all of that is true, and all of that requires great shifts in policy, law, regulation, and the elections that may feed those. But our view, and my view personally, is that culture precedes structure. That culture, by which I mean our values, our norms, our narratives, our myths, our habits, our mindsets, often unspoken, often webbed together in a collective, that those shape the frame of the possible when it comes to structural change, right? Now, I'm not saying it's unidirectional. I think once, the nature of all complex systems is that everything shapes everything. So at a certain point, structure also shapes culture. But where we've decided to put our energy at Citizen University is on trying to build a culture of powerful, responsible citizenship, to think about how we shift norms, values, habits, mindsets, heart sets about the responsibility that we have, about whether we are spectators or participants, and about how we take a mass multicultural society and create some sense of common purpose and shared identity out of that.
It all sounds very American, Eric. At Citizen University, are you in the business of essentially teaching or enabling agency? Is that one way of describing it?
Political agency? That is one way of describing it. That is. And I think, I think agency captures both an element of power, but also this sense that culture is not something that happens to us. We are the creators of it, and we are all. I mean, let me put in the affirmative a metaphor that during COVID has a negative cast, and that is we are all nodes of contagion. We are able to set off a cascade of a different set of attitudes by whether we behave in a pro-social or an anti-social way, whether we behave with a sense of reciprocity or mere selfishness, whether we are compassionate or civil or uncaring and uncivil, right? And these are not just the dot. So this is the way in which what we're talking about is actually quite not American, Andrew. I think there's some way in which what I'm saying here is quite countercultural. It cuts against the grain of much of American life, because much of American life is about hyper-individualism and the sense that I should be able to do whatever the hell I want.
What does that even mean, hyper-individualism?
Say what?
What does that mean? It means that you believe that you are agent of your own narrative?
It means you don't care what the consequences are of your actions and how they may impact others. So it is tyranny for me to have to wear a mask. It is unacceptable that I should be restrained from doing what I feel the liberty to do, right? There are two categories of people who think that life is about rights without responsibilities. One is toddlers, and the other is sociopaths. And I think we are in the business of creating non-sociopaths in our work at Citizen University.
Some of your speeches I've watched and some of your work, you suggest that civic identity could be a new religion. You've initiated, I think, civic Saturdays. You've talked about citizen seminaries. Are you comfortable with the idea of turning the idea of citizenship into a 21st century religion?
I am indeed. I think we speak of this in our work as civic religion, and again, it has a particularly American cast because life in the United States, we often forget this, but in as diverse and sprawling a nation as we are, there really is only one thing that binds us together, and that is a creed, a set of ideas and ideals that, when you stop and look at them, are rather flimsy. The only thing that breathes life into those ideas and ideals is not the sacredness of the Constitution as a piece of paper. The only thing that breathes life into those words is our collective, repeated, mutual agreement to make them mean something. And that requires practice, that requires cultivation, and it requires a sense of intentional spirit. And this is why, to me, democracy is, in fact, one of the most faith-driven activities there is. I don't mean faith in a deity. I mean faith in the possibility that we could govern ourselves successfully. Democracy works only if enough of us believe democracy works.
You mentioned Tocqueville earlier, and again, my reading of Tocqueville, everyone has a different reading, is that what he saw as the strength of American democracy when he came in the 19th century were the intermediary institutions, the churches and the schools and the other institutions that lay between the individual and the state, which he didn't find in Europe. So rather than seeing citizenship or civics as a religion, perhaps Tocqueville would suggest that it's institutions which are key to protecting good citizenship.
I think it's very much a both and. I am Tocquevillian in that sense as well. I mean, associational life is a layer of the American ecosystem that has evaporated in our lifetimes. And that is a big part of why we have the crisis of democracy that we have right now.
Is it a crisis? Sorry, and I didn't keep on meaning to interrupt you, Eric, but is it a crisis? Do you see American democracy is currently in crisis?
I do. I mean, I think, certainly at the national level, we need not rehearse the facts of January 6th and even what preceded that. But even at the local level, I mean, as we sit here, we're less than a couple of months away from a mayoral election in New York City, where the New York Times reports today, most people have literally no idea who's running or what's going on. There's a sense of disconnection, even at the local level, from government politics. There are polls and surveys that Pew and others have done that show that the rising younger generations have rapidly declining faith in democracy as such, and no longer believe the way that older generations did, that democracy was inherently a preferable, a better approach to self-government. And so there's a crisis in operation, there's a crisis in belief. And that returns, I want to close your question on civic religion, because when I say that democracy works only if enough of us believe democracy works, what I mean then is that belief, our shared belief, requires cultivation. And this gets to the heart of my understanding of what religion is. When a lot of people, perhaps including Margaret Atwood, criticize or fear organized religion, they have a particular definition of religion in mind, which is not only as a top-down, domination-oriented institution, but one that is about dogmatism and righteous fury and inquisitions and the rest. And sure, history gives you plenty of cause to define religion that way. But what I think about when I define religion, whether civic or otherwise, is perhaps something more in a fusion of Zen, Jesuit, and Judaic, explorations of, it is about discernment. It is about asking questions. It is about doubt. It is about a search for meaning that is not easily findable. It is about reckoning with the contradictions between our stated beliefs and the way we actually behave in our hearts, feel, and move. And it's about shades of gray. And that capacity for moral discernment, that capacity for figuring out how we strike that balance between, moral precepts and the choices and pressures and wants of the moment, is something that in civic life, whether you believe in a God or you believe in the absence of a God, we need that kind of moral muscle building together as responsibility-taking neighbors, not as parishioners looking on to a high priest, but as people who take collective mutual responsibility for the moral fabric of our society.
Eric, you've talked about democracy in some of your speeches, particularly your very popular TED speeches, as a kind of carnival, as a celebration, physical celebration. Are you suggesting that we return to the carnivalesque, perhaps to pre-modern notions of politics and of celebration and community?
Well, I believe in general there is and ought to be a fusion of citizenship and art, of the process of self-government, the miracle of self-government, and the joy of collective creation, art, festival, so on and so forth. And that plays out particularly around voting. We had a project at Citizen University called The Joy of Voting. And all we wanted to do in that was to reanimate a culture that used to exist in the United States around voting and elections, of carnival, street fair, dueling concerts by bands, and parades, and toasting and bonfires. And the idea was that voting was not just a dry ministerial act conducted in private isolation, but rather a collective expression of the miracle of community, right? And which, by the way, is the way that Emil Durkheim defined religion itself, right? I mean, religion in the end is the group kind of sacralizing the miracle of its existence. That miracle is something that can be expressed in a joyful way. And so the Joy of Voting Project, we provided seed grants to artists, musicians, dancers, creators of all kinds in local communities around the United States to create a traveling theater company that would get on the back of a flatbed pickup truck and go from neighborhood to neighborhood in Akron, Ohio, performing short plays about the election. All-night concerts in Miami with the best DJs in town, where the price of admission was simply having shown that you'd registered to vote. Things like that were able to kind of create that sense that, again, back to your original question, not only that civics is sexy, but that this is not just a matter of eat your vegetables, do your duty, be a less bad person, right? This is about join the club, join the party. There's collective purpose to be found in this. And I think, once we get fully out of COVID, among the things that will be slingshot back to life, I think, is this desire to make meaning together in all kinds of creative, joyful ways. And that will happen in purely social, fun ways, but I think it can and should happen in civic ways as well.
Eric, in this third series of How to Fix Democracy, we have not only an American, a United States of America theme, but also a Canadian one. And I think one of the things we're finding in the differences between the Canadian, the American experience and understanding of democracy is that Canadians seem more intrigued and open to the idea of returning to the ideals and ideas and traditions of a pre-colonial past. But is there anything when it comes to citizenship we can learn from the indigenous tribes? You're in Seattle, I'm in San Francisco, who once inhabited, who dominated the entire western seaboard of this continent?
Oh, absolutely. I think, I grew up, I am in Seattle right now, and this is a community, the Northwest in general, that pays attention to those still very visible layers of our history that were formed and shaped by Native communities. This is Duwamish land originally that I sit in right now. But I grew up in upstate New York, and I went to public schools in New York, and public schools in New York did a relatively good job in the 70s and 80s of teaching us about the Iroquois Confederacy, about the Mohawks, about those tribes in what became New York, whose not only demographic presence shaped demography, economy, and those tangible things, but whose models and examples of how they governed themselves shaped early colonial attempts at self-government, right? And so the ways in which, whether you're looking strictly through a historical lens at past models and examples, or looking today in contemporary terms at ways in which Native communities themselves right now are contesting the very idea of Americanness and the content of citizenship. And that's a good thing. I think that it is a good thing to have continual claiming and contestation about the meaning of American. And I think that can and should be a part of this. But I think you're right that Canada, having done far more as a society to acknowledge what in Canada is called First Nations, both as a matter of recognition and reparation, but also as a matter of continuing civic culture. There's a lot that the United States can learn there from Canada. You mentioned earlier, Andrew, Civic Saturdays, which is one of these programs we have at Citizen University. And these are a civic analog to a faith gathering, right? On purpose. They have the arc and the flow of a faith gathering. And some of that arc and flow comes from a Judeo-Christian template. There's a sermon, there are readings of text that you might think of as civic scripture, and so forth. But what we also draw on are other traditions. At the end of every one of these Civic Saturdays, people form up in what you might call, in a Native American tradition, talking circles. We call them civic circles, but they are circles not only of reflection to talk about what we just heard in the civic sermon just delivered, but now to kind of pivot to what shall we do together? How will we, this circle of six sitting next to 10, 20, 30 other circles of six in this room, how will we make some commitments to each other about how we're going to take those ideas and ideals and put them into practice in our part of town, right?
Is that a more informal version of citizen assemblies?
I mean, it's a cousin to it. I mean, I think citizen assemblies get more to the actual power of decision-making and policy-making. These civic circles are more, again, to build that muscle of association, to build that muscle of being able to humanize people who might be quite unlike you in religion, looks, race, ideology, whatever it is, generation. And so it is perhaps a step prior to citizen assemblies as bodies of legitimate decision-making, but they're very connected.
Eric, we've had a number of shows about the African-American experience in America, what we can learn from the catastrophe of slavery, the other injustices, and perhaps what African-Americans can particularly teach America about remaking, reforming, improving its democracy. Your family originally came from China, then Taiwan. You've even written a book, The Accidental Asian. Is there anything of the East Asian tradition, do you think, that can be learned by American democracy?
I think there's a ton that the United States can learn right now from Asian cultures, from Americans of Asian descent. And I think there are two broad categories, I would say, of learning. The first is a bit back to what we were talking about earlier on this kind of spectrum from hyper-individualism to hyper-collectivism, right? The People's Republic of China right now is a pretty hyper-collectivist society and authoritarian in its form of government and so forth. But there is forget about the PRC or the Chinese Communist Party. If you dig many layers deeper to civilizational patterns in China, there is a pattern of just thinking in collectives, thinking in community, that the United States could stand to take a few droppers full of that way of thinking and inject that into our stream of values and ways of living. That we could stand to have a bit more communitarianism. We could stand to have a bit more sense of mutual responsibility. We could stand to have a bit more of a sense of history that lasts longer than today's Twitter feed, right? Civilization length history, which are all things that are baked into the operating system of China. And those are good things. But the other thing that I would say that we can learn, whether from China or any other Asian society, is almost by contrast. And that is this, that as you know, there's so much anxiety in American life right now about the fact that China's rising, and there will come someday, perhaps soon, where just as a matter of sheer throw weight, China's GDP may surpass that of the United States, and they can get to claim the #1 flag, biggest economy, and all that. I don't care. Like, when that day comes, it still will not change the fact, in my view, and I say this as a Chinese American, as a second generation American, it will not change the fact that there is something exceptional here in the United States that can and must be preserved. There is a competitive advantage that the United States retains if we don't blow it. And the way to understand that advantage is this: America makes Chinese Americans. China does not make American Chinese. Period. We in the United States have, as it is not in the operating system, mindset, or habit set of people in China to take someone like you could get fluent in Mandarin, move to China, decide to spend the rest of your life there, raise a family there. You will never be Chinese, truly. You will never get a chance to fully integrate into Chinese life, much less have some agency to redefine the meaning of Chineseness and have your children and your children's children reshape the face, the look, the sound, the spirit of Chineseness, right? That's not in their operating system. That is the very point of our operating system here in the United States, right? And when I say if we don't blow it, I mean if we don't blow it by succumbing to nativism, succumbing to immigration restrictionism, but also if we don't blow it in the sense that, giving into an idea that immigrants need to quickly assimilate and shed the cultures and the mores of their family's heritage. No, the thing that makes the United States potentially resilient, cycle over cycle, generation over generation, is that we are the rest of the world put together. And that is a thing, that possibility of hybridity, generating hybrids that the rest of the planet has not yet contemplated, is the thing that we cannot squander.
Finally, Eric, let's come back where we began to the issue of citizenship and sexiness, or making citizenship sexy or sexier. As I said at the beginning of the interview, you're the co-author, I think the co-chair of a bipartisan, a 2020 bipartisan study, Our Common Purpose, on strengthening the infrastructure of American democracy, on making better citizens. To finish this conversation, very briefly, perhaps you might suggest 2 or 3 very concrete suggestions that came out of Our Common Purpose, this bipartisan study that you were intimately involved with.
Yes, thank you for asking that, Andrew. Our Common Purpose is the product of a commission of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we came out with a report in June of 2020 with 31 recommendations for reinventing our democracy. And those recommendations go actually very much to the architecture of the way that you've led this conversation, Andrew, in talking about the relationship between 3 parts of a cycle that's either going to be a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle, depending on how we show up. Part 1 is our institutions, like you were talking about. Part 2 is our civic culture, like I was talking about. And part 3 is the thing that you were referring to in the Tocquevillian terms, civil society, our network of associations and clubs, right? Those 3 things in a virtuous cycle, when things are going well, they all feed each other. Associational life is rich and strong. That gives us the practice to kind of show up in our institutions and make sure our institutions of government are responsive to us and not rigging the game. And that makes a culture in which people are rewarded for showing up and participating. And that's a good thing. But what we're living through right now in the United States is more than a few turns down the vicious cycle in which our institutions become rigged and corrupted and people lose faith in them. They stop showing up for associational life because they think, why bother? It's not worth it. And then the culture becomes one of retreating to your private little circle and not caring about the greater good anymore, right? And so our recommendations in this report are all about trying to turn that cycle back the other way on each of those dimensions. On the institutional reforms, we have ideas like enlarging the size of the House of Representatives so that it's far more responsive to the people. The fact that we have 435 members of the House right now is not carved in the Constitution. That's a matter of statute. It could be a matter of statute to increase that number dramatically to make Congress more responsive to people rather than money. There are ideas like national service as a universal expectation for young people to kind of foster this culture of mutual responsibility and commitment to one another. And there are recommendations as well that have to do with that are not just quixotic, but are things that we can do right now, that are happening right now, like ranked choice voting as a way to make elections far more meaningful to far more people and make the results of those elections far more representative of diverse constituencies. All of these things are within our grasp and doable. And we've set a goal in this commission of making substantial progress in all 31 of those recommendations over the next 5 years, so that by 2026, the 250th birthday of the United States, we can say that we have securely turned that cycle from vicious to virtuous and set it in motion. Our common purpose is the report. If you just Google that or go to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, you can find it there. But we've also built a network of champions from around the United States, organizations and individuals who are raising their hand to say, we're going to take on this piece. We're going to bring these ideas to Little Rock, Arkansas. We're going to do this work to rebuild the civic infrastructure in our community. And that's what it's going to take, a vast flotilla of people choosing to take responsibility for their piece of the problem. And over not just the next 5 years, but probably the next 5 decades, we can repair what is broken in the body politic.
Well, that vast flotilla is, I think, in some ways controlled by Admiral Liu, who has dedicated his life to improving both democracy and particularly citizenship in America. I want to thank you so much. Real honor to talk. Wonderful to have you as a participant in our How to Fix Democracy series. I feel like I've at least begun Citizen University. Eric, thank you so much. Eric Liu.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been great to be with you.